Hi, welcome back to hopefully more regular series of live streams now. This one was prompted by conversations around average, and what I want to talk about over the course of maybe 5 minutes is the idea of applying what we would regard as generic or average process to individual molecules, and why I in particular, but IDEA in general, hates the TPP as a way of kind of compromising your product down to this average, meaningless profile that really is useless to you as a drug developer. And this was sparked by some thoughts that we had on the Pharmaceutical Innovation Index this year, and some stats that fall out of that, like the average cost of developing a drug. And you may have seen some thoughts on that we had in the last week or so on if you take the average R&D spend of companies over the last 5 years and you divide that very simply by the number of approvals that they've had, on average we're arriving at a cost of about $6 billion per approval across the top 30 pharma companies. Now, of course, that's an interesting number, but it doesn't mean that the cost of developing a molecule is $6 billion. And that's actually the way that it's been taken. And I think that, for me, illustrates part of the challenge of pharmaceuticals, which is that people want to take averages and apply them to individual products or individual companies, and it doesn't work that way. A couple of charts really to illustrate my point. This is the chart of, and I will send this out to anyone that wants to see it, but I'll probably take off these names that you can't see. So this 6 billion number comes across the middle of, this is the top 30 pharma companies and their R&D spend per approval. If you do that just very simple math, and I'm very aware that it's not the most elegant way to do this, because the spend in the last 5 years hopefully wasn't just on the approvals in the last 5 years, it's about the next 5, 10, 20 years of development. But you can see some very big differences in here. One company probably cost about $12.5 billion per approval in the last 5 years. There are some companies that are trending down towards the $2.5 billion. So it's an interesting number. It's not the most useful. But actually, one thing I wanted to focus on in this conversation was really on how our current process works. Many of you will have seen this chart, which is, I'd recommend you look at Brad Longcar's blog on checkpoints and immuno-oncology in general. And a lot of people have been talking a lot about how Keytruda has caught up and overtaken Opdivo, and that's, there's reasons that it's doing that. But one thing I wanted to draw your attention to was, these are essentially interchangeable molecules. There is no one today that could tell you that one of them is better than another, and if you put one into the other studies, that it wouldn't do just the same job or better. There's no one that can tell you that. And I've asked several oncologists and pharma developers about whether they believe that innately one of these products is better than the other, but they won't tell you that. But look at the numbers. The numbers are, and if you look at this oval, it's a really interesting oval, because clearly Opdivo, which is the black bars in this chart, did an awful lot better than Keytruda for the 3 years before Keytruda caught up. And then when you ask folks, they start to think, well, that must be because of this and because of that and so forth. A bunch of reasons. But actually, I want you to think about this number here: $6 billion in sales in the 3 years that Opdivo has generated that Keytruda hasn't. Now, $6 billion handily is a number that's very similar to the average cost of an approval across the top 30. And it's relevant. And it's relevant to me because, not just because we worked on Opdivo, but because these are choices that individuals made in teams at a pharmaceutical company to make a difference to this kind of a sales curve. And then you come back to, well, could you have forecast either of these drugs in the marketplace? And if you'd run through an average process, you would have arrived at an average forecast, which would have probably been wrong because it would have ignored all of those things. And the reason that it's an issue is because any forecast, any projection about how a product's going to do on the marketplace relies on assumptions, what ifs, if-thens. And all of those things, all of those what ifs and if-thens are compromised down to this single number that actually doesn't mean anything. And the issue that we have with that is that these are individual molecules where you'll make choices about indication, about time to market, about whether you buy a marker or don't buy a marker, how you're going to position and brand these molecules. All of those matter. And if they're ignored within the forecast development process, then actually you've got no real sense of how successful any of those molecules could be when they get there. But let's say that you chose in this particular race to be third or fourth or fifth or sixth or probably 10th or 20th to market when you look at the number of checkpoints coming down the line. The world probably has enough in its to make it happy, given the way that the market currently behaves. But let's come back to that thing. People made choices about how to launch Opdivo. Different people made different choices about how to launch Keytruda. One of those teams was way more successful in the first 2-3 years than the other. Clearly, Bristol Myers Squibb need a better strategy to take the product forward because they're giving ground to Keytruda in a way that perhaps was avoidable. But the issue in general is in excellence processes, in launch readiness processes. Because if you think about the way that they operate by arriving at a process that applies to all drugs rather than to the one drug that you've got. So all drugs are made to do the same thing. They have a checklist, they have a series of things that they have to go through. And what I want you to think about is whether that is working for us in standardizing our approach to development and commercializing, whereas each of those products is individual. And if we continue to treat them as generic, and if we continue to treat them as average, then we've got an essential problem if we want them to outperform and to be differentiated when they get there. So it comes back really to our philosophy that any one product has a bunch of things that you could decide to do that aren't the same. You could get it there faster, you could get it there bigger, you could get it there for a precision medicine approach with a biomarker. Each of those has consequences. And if you try and pretend that there's one best way to do this, then you're wrong. You have lots of different paths that you could take to market. One of those may well be best for you. It may not be best for company B, C, D, or E, but actually it may be best for you. You may decide that in this particular horse race, getting to the line first makes a very big difference. Clearly, in some markets it does. You might decide to turn left and look for a different opportunity in a different field. All of those should be alive within the drug development process. So it comes back to this kind of core idea that if you'd tried to forecast a checkpoint inhibitor and you didn't pick one of these two curves, you would have been wrong. And that core hypothesis is that you cannot forecast by molecule because the team and the choices that they make are at least as important to future success or even failure of the drug in the clinic, as we've seen so often in phase 3 recently, has become an issue. And this is even more of an issue when you get into the fact of how many companies have reached the threshold of delivering back $6 billion to their development companies. Now, the truth is, not very many companies are hitting that hurdle. And if you saw my recent blog post on LinkedIn, you'll know the exact numbers that we're just failing to hit those kind of thresholds. So let's assume that $6 billion is a useful number. Some companies are getting there, with less money. Let's assume 6 billion is a useful threshold. Only 6 drugs launched in the last 5 years have reached that 6 billion in cumulative sales. Now, this is sales, not even profit, not continuing to support them, with the hypothesis being currently that if you want to generate $6 billion in profit, you're probably going to need to recoup about 43 billion in sales just using industry standard figures. So 6 drugs have hit that, 5 drugs have hit that 6 billion threshold. Even if you apply the rule of what's a blockbuster, there's only 11% of drugs that launched in the last 5 years that have got close to becoming blockbusters on a $1 billion sales year in 2017. So not many of the drugs that we're launching are getting to the point of delivering what we would regard as success. Our core hypothesis is that that's because of the processes that we're applying. We've seen an interesting trend towards more interesting companies like Gilead doing more interesting things with molecules and development, becoming phenomenally successful on the way through. So keep this very short. if we continue to apply generic processes, any excellence process that tries to do the same thing for all of your pipeline is automatically doing the wrong thing. There has to be room for maneuver that says each product has to be taken on its own merits. That applies to marketing, that applies to development, it applies to discovery too. So avoiding generic is absolutely key to this. But also, we've got a lot of big hurdles that we've got to get over. If we're failing on drugs by launching drugs that aren't successfully commercial, that means they're not getting to patients. And given that our job is to get medicines to patients, we have a fantastic surrogate for whether that is happening or not. And in many cases, we're launching drugs that just are not getting there. Whether that's the market access hurdle, whether that's the physician preference hurdle or the patient preference hurdle. In ignoring those for each of the individual products we've got, we're not doing justice. So think about the Opdivo Keytruda case study, because we're living through one of the most interesting case studies in pharmaceutical history right in front of us. Rational marketplace has decided to favor one of the drugs over the other so far. Even today, although Keytruda looks more effective, we still don't know. What it's done is choose better studies, it's choose places where it looks better, it's choose ways of sort of cutting the patient population so that its headline data are more impressive. That's a choice. That's a choice they're making now for their life cycle. One that any one of the other companies could have decided to do. And I think that's the thing to bear in mind. Teams and people are making decisions that make products successful, and to pretend that it's the molecule at the core of that is only the start of the story. So that's it. We'll be back to doing this regularly, hopefully once a week from now on in. If you want to see the slide, or you want to send me any questions about it, I will pop my email in the titles. So thanks, and see you soon.